Like, oh, I'm just existing because of this identity or this politician. Now it's that politician or it's this. All of these things, these are just horrible substitutes for knowing your place in the cosmos.
Welcome back to Mind Matters. Last week in our discussion on the Holy Grail, I pointed out that all of the main Grail stories were composed over around a 50-year period from 1180 to 1230. And around that time, we mentioned what was going on, for example, the cathedral building, that the Gothic architecture that sprung up around that time, and also that it was a time of intense activity in Sufism. So today we're going to get into a bit about Sufism, what it is, and some of the Sufis from around that time and some of the things they were saying. One of whom is known as Ibn al-Arabi. His name is longer than that, but that's what we'll refer to him as. I've heard it pronounced either Arabi or Arabi, so we might fluctuate between the two. Arabi was born in 1165 and died in 1240. Again, right around the time of the Holy Grail stories up in France. He was actually Spanish, so he was born just south of where all that Grail activity was going on. And he's got a bit of an interesting story. He apparently experienced what is called an opening or an unveiling. This is kind of like a mystical experience where kind of the barriers between the human material realm and the divine realm kind of blast wide open, and he experienced like an intense vision at the age of like 12 or 13. Apparently that's when he experienced this, and throughout the rest of his life, he experienced more of these visions and openings. But in that first one, that was the thing that kind of like blew his mind wide open. And for the rest of his career, he basically, all the things that he wrote, all of the vast numbers of books that he wrote were attempts to put into words what he experienced in that first vision, in addition to the stuff that he experienced in his mystical experiences for the rest of his life. And just to get an idea of how prolific this guy was, his main work, which is called the Meccan Openings, is from what I can tell, in like a critical edition that was published of it, it's something like 37 volumes, around 17,000 pages. And that was just one of his works. Of course, not all of his works were that long, but some were quite short, maybe 100 pages. But it just gives some idea of how prolific he was in his writing. He wrote hundreds of works. I think there are something like 400 that are still available, and he wrote maybe like 800 different unique works over his life. And he was kind of an expert of all of the entire Islamic tradition of that period of time, whether jurisprudence or philosophy or Sufism, which is the kind of mystical branch, the inner knowledge of the Quran, the inner knowledge and the practice of that kind of inner spirituality. So we'll be talking a bit about that, and maybe also, I'm going to be bringing up some stuff about Rumi too. Rumi's probably the most famous Sufi in the Western world through his poetry. You can find all kinds of books in the spirituality sections or poetry sections of bookstores on Rumi and his poetry. He was born in 1205 and died in 1273. So he's basically a generation younger than Ibn Arabi. And again, famous for his poetry. And he had an interesting life too. He had a connection to Arabi through one of his pupils, who was, I believe, the stepson of al-Arabi. And so while Arabi wrote all kinds of like in-depth, arcane, difficult to understand theory on practically every subject imaginable, Rumi was a poet. And so he expressed the things, he expressed these mystical experiences, as they call them, states in Sufism, through these poems. And then later in life, he started composing a series of more didactic poems to kind of give an introduction to Sufism. And so his two main works are divided between those two. One, the poems that are kind of describing each individual spiritual experience that Rumi himself had, and then more of a teaching, more like a teaching guide, but not very systematic. It was kind of still poetry, so it's still kind of delivered in an artful form. So those are probably the two. I don't know if we'll be talking about any other Sufis, but we'll just see where it goes from there. So maybe to start out with, Sufism, we want to know what that really is. And so I don't know if either of you guys have any, maybe anything personal to share, like how you first found out about Sufism, or if you would just want to launch into, a starting point for what it actually is. Anything?
Well, I can definitely not give a definitive answer on that, but I can just hazard an attempt to explain what I understand Sufism's role to be, at least in the Islamic world, back in the 12th century, and the role that Ibn Arabi played, because for him. I was listening to an interview with William Chittick, and he said that Ibn Arabi never called himself a Sufi. Like, he never really considered himself anything besides someone who was trying to perfect man's inner nature. And so that the things that he wrote about and he discussed and he investigated, and the visions that he had were all directed towards bringing an awareness of God and the self into his life and into the lives of the people around him. And so it was always deeply rooted in the Islamic tradition. And yet for the Sufis in general, and in that period of time, from what I understand, is that it was considered to be two main branches of knowledge. And that the one branch of knowledge was the kind of knowledge that just is transferred over generations, and it's very practical, the sciences and just the down-to-earth knowledge. But that in the Sufi tradition, this branch, this way of knowing the world, through the intellect, science, and all the whatever kind of methods that are used, was it was something that was to be used only by necessity. It's like only if you need this to complete a project of some kind or to live well, that this is a body of knowledge that's worth investigating. But the other body of knowledge that was much more important to investigate was God, and in every dimension. And that was the big thing that I think even al-Arabi did, was he saw God, and he saw like the anatomy of God, and then he went and he wrote out the anatomy of God, and he used a vocabulary that obviously we don't have today, a vocabulary of faith that is kind of strange and challenging to read, because it's a romance. It's a romance between man and God, between you and yourself, and it's in many ways it's challenging, because I think in the modern world we're really rather faithless in those terms. We put all of our faith into transmitted information. That's knowledge that's transmitted, father to son, through universities, through colleges, through professional careers and papers and journals. And yet the direct experience in the heart of love, of God, of understanding what it means to say that God is all merciful and that there is no God but God, and to discuss things like the nature of being and the oneness of being in the cosmos, to understand, to seek and to investigate through faculties that aren't, just purely eyeballs and brains. It's to understand on a deep personal level what it means to be in this universe, and to be a part of all of these myriad possibilities of what God is and what God isn't, and to understand that that you're always walking a tightrope, because it's You know, it's not just blind faith, but it's an understanding that God is and God isn't at the same time. That this is God and this is not God, and that God is all merciful and God is tyrannical. That there are these different faces of God, and to understand what that means and how you can how to make any sense of any of it. You know, what is God? You know, this kind of answer, this question, I think is Ibn al-Arabi's work. It's his life work, is to understand and to transmit, you know, for us, so that we can take that information and we can apply it ourselves and seek out the answer for ourselves, because that's always going to be a unique and very personal understanding that you're not going to get tested on it in, you know, college. You're not going to get an answer. You're not going to find the answer in a book, but through the heart and through the purification of the heart, there's some hope that we can understand.
Yeah, and that distinction that you made, Corey, between the transmitted teachings, which is called the takfir, next to the kind of knowledge that comes from intellectual understanding and development of the self as relates to one's relationship to God, is called the Tawheed. Probably not pronouncing either of those terms correctly, but that's a real biggie, because William Chittick, who we'll be referencing a lot today because he is probably one of the premier professors and students of Sufism and ancient Islamism, he is explaining, especially through this book, which is called Science of the Cosmos, Science of the Soul. He is bringing to us, in his best understanding of what Sufism really was intended to do, and looks at it in terms of what Islamism has become in this modern world. And he's quite critical. He makes mention of the fact that there is a sense of dogmatism and appeal to authority and ideological influence that gets very far away from the types of thinking that Sufism was meant to induce in the practitioner, which was the development of the self, which was the development of one's own personal connection to the real, to God, to the hierarchy of the universe that we would seem to take for granted in today's versions of religion. And you can apply this to all sorts of modern, secularized, dumbed down, dogmatized versions of, you know, the world's great religions. So one of those definitions, Tawheed, is explained in his book. He writes, "All reality is unified in its principle. Everything in the universe comes from God and returns to God, and everything is utterly and absolutely dependent upon God, here and now, always and forever, in every time and in every place." And his point is that, you know, Sufism has been called this kind of mystical tradition or religion. It's been sort of denigrated and poo-pooed as a new age version of religion. Oh, you're a Sufi, that type of thing. But his point is no, there is an intellectual tradition deep in Sufism that is being encouraged in the practitioner that doesn't take any of the writings in any of the great works, in the Quran, in the other texts, for granted. There is a constant imploring that one should question these things, that if anything, they should be a point of departure for more questions. And it's through that questioning, through the development of the fatir, or this kind of deep soul intellect, that we come to have this direct understanding of God through knowledge of ourselves, because God is in us. We are a part of the macrocosm and a part of the hierarchy. And to lose sight of ourselves within this cosmology is to lose sight of what is real.
Well, that gets back to something Corey was saying about the transmitted knowledge and the real knowledge. That comes back to the real. The Sufis, in particular Rumi, didn't like mainstream philosophy very much, or at least, particularly Arabi and Rumi, that there was kind of a difference between the kind of, how to put it, worldly philosophizing and the inner truth of religion. So in one of his poems, Rumi writes, "Thy life has gone to waste in the consideration of logical predicate and subject. Thy life, devoid of spiritual insight, has gone in study of what has been received by hearsay. Every proof, logical proof, that is without a spiritual result and effect is in vain. Consider the final result of thyself." Basically saying, you could apply this to any academic today, living today, if you just look at academia. What's the result of your knowledge? Look at yourself. Are you a particularly great human being? Well, they might think so, but in reality, they're not. They're just as great as their intellects are, and as great as their intellectual achievements might be to the world, they are usually often just as mediocre human beings as everyone else. Nothing great to distinguish them on the kind of soul level, on the level of their character, or on the level of their spiritual development, however we want to define that. So Chittick writes, and this is in his book, The Sufi Doctrine of Rumi. Look at that. It's got pictures in it, so it's nice. He says, first one other quote from Rumi. "The great scholars of the age split hairs on all manner of sciences. They know perfectly and have a complete comprehension of those matters which do not concern them. But as for what is truly of moment and touches a man more closely than all else, namely his own self, this your great scholar does not know." So then Chittick writes, "Man must know himself in order that he can escape from himself. All other knowledge is worthless." Then he quotes Rumi once more. "Make a journey out of self into your real self, O master. For by such a journey, earth becomes a quarry of gold." So there's this, reading the Sufis, in particular these two, Rumi and al-Arabi, they often remind me of Gurdjieff, naturally, because, there's a whole hypothesis that Gurdjieff learned something or other from Sufi traditions in Central Asia. And there are a lot of points of similarity between the two practices and doctrines, and one of which is this this focus on what is actually practical and useful. There's probably a better word for that, for the actual person in what they come to know. Because you can learn a whole bunch of facts about anything and, like I said, still remain a kind of a non-entity, a rather useless human being. But the knowledge that seems to matter the most, and this is what Gurdjieff focused on too, was self-knowledge and what to actually do in order to transform. And Chittick actually defines what he calls Sufi psychology, keeping in mind that by psychology he's including the entire psyche, which is like the soul, not the psyche as reduced by modern psychologists, kind of the purely like behaviorist, mechanical, low-level self, like the nafs or the flesh in the Sufi terminology.
Let me just comment on something you said, Harrison, because there is a lot of Gurdjieff here, and as well as Zoroaster and Apostle Paul, and that's, again, and I think we've been saying some of these things in the past few shows, there is this overlap or seeing the same picture from these perspectives that are shared that just compound the truth of looking at the relationship between the individual self and the cosmology of the universe, one's relationship to metaphysics and the rest of the world in its deepest sense. And just getting back to that point about Gurdjieff's being so influenced by some of this, there's this passage here which reminded me quite a lot of Gurdjieff's idea of bankruptcy, which is this idea that we have to die to all of the selfish, egocentric, self-centered tendencies that we have. Chittick writes, the cosmos is animated by two simultaneous movements. First is the centrifugal movement away from the source. Second, the centripetal movement toward the source. These are what the philosophical tradition commonly called al-mabda, while ma'ad, the origin of the return. The Sufis often use the expression al-qas, al-nuzuli, and al-qas al-su'udi, the descending arc and the ascending arc. The issues discussed are cosmogenesis and eschatology. When addressing the fact that all things naturally and necessarily go back to their origin, the tradition also discusses the uniquely human privilege of voluntarily returning to God. Freely choosing to return is precisely the raison d'être of realization, and realization is another name for voluntary return. Or, in Sufi language, the voluntary return provides the means to, quote, die before you die. So there is the sense that there is a free will decision here to become part of what might be an ascending movement towards God or a descending movement away from the human self, away from God. But to ascend would require that one relinquish those things, as in the bankruptcy that was mentioned earlier, a la Gurdjieff. So I think Gurdjieff put these ideas in his own terms and came up with his own ideas for how to express and convey them. But, you know, when we read In Search of the Miraculous and the rays of creation, there is this strong connection, I feel, to these two forces, centrifugal and centripetal as well, and the free will choice to become a part of something that is either greater or lesser than ourselves and our potential.
Yeah, that gets back to this idea of the transmitted knowledge and what's transmitted and what's received, because, well, there's another form of transmission in addition to just the transmission of normal, like, worldly knowledge. This was the point I was going to get to previously, was just that like you mentioned, Ilan, in Paul's letters too, Paul has this kind of denigration of worldly knowledge and worldly wisdom, and that the true wisdom is that comes from God. So you find the same idea in Sufism. You find it probably in the esoteric traditions of any religion, or the inner traditions of any religion. And for the transmission of knowledge, like Ibn al-Arabi was, as Chittick puts it in one of his books, Sufi Path, or what's it called? Yeah, Sufi Path of Knowledge. On the one hand, Arabi was this great kind of mystic or philosopher with all these inner experiences and relating all the kind of secret teachings. But on the other hand, he was also a literalist. So he argued that every passage, every word in the Quran was like divinely inspired and the absolute truth. And it was just that, so you had to take it literally, but there was a hidden meaning that encompassed the literal meaning. So the part of the transmitted knowledge was the Quran, the things that came down from tradition, and that kind of had to be preserved. But then there was the hidden meaning, the inner meaning that could only be experienced and truly known through oneself and through one's own like inner knowing, as opposed to just the external knowing of just remembering facts or something like that. And one of the things Chittick also points out is that Arabi talks about the I think it's the 124,000 prophets. So from the time of Adam to the time of Muhammad, there were 124,000 prophets, and they each received basically the divine word and put it in terms and in a language for the context and the people that could hear it. So naturally, in one time and place, the divine word would be given in this language for this people, and then it would take a different form here and there and here and there. Al-Arabi only, of course, focused on the specifically Islamic context, because that was his culture, but at least there was this recognition of all these previous prophets, before Muhammad, that presented this type of thing in a necessarily non-Islamic form. This also has a resonance with the fourth way as Gurdjieff presents it, and in that there is an idea of a tradition passed on through time from person to person, directly from, and you could trace something back to its very source at the beginning, and it has this direct line of transmission. But there's also, that is put into practice by the Sufis in the form of their Sufi orders and their schools, because whenever a Sufi would gain kind of like the grand, like divine achievement, whenever like full spiritual realization, they would often start their own order. So that today we've got I don't even know how many Sufi orders there are, but there are, if not dozens, then hundreds of them. Maybe dozens, again, I don't know for sure. But so you've got like the Mevlevi order, which traces back to Rumi. You've got the Naqshbandi. You've got all kinds of ones. So you've got this direct transmission all within this one system, or one, if not system, this one, just tradition. But if you look at Gurdjieff's description of the fourth way, there's the same idea and there's the same tension between a tradition that's passed on in the same form to one that arises in a specific situation without necessarily any direct antecedent, without any direct line of transmission into the past. And you can see this if you take the ideas if you take what actually happens in this Sufi practice, which is this divine opening, then you can see that if that's part of human nature to have this possibility of divine opening, then like with the 124,000 prophets, it can happen in any place at any time. So it will probably necessarily take a different form than it took in any previous example. So you've got all of these different forms of like the divine truth that spring up in different cultures at different times without necessarily any direct connection to each other, but which all perhaps express the same truth, perhaps just in a different form and different clothing. And that's one of the ideas that comes across in some of what Chittick writes about al-Arabi and Rumi, is that this idea that there are three, I don't know if they're what we call the modes of, let me check my notes, modes of transmission, or just three aspects of Sufism. Yeah, just the three main aspects of Sufism. The way he describes it is that there is basically knowledge, works, and spiritual realization. So there's the knowledge, which is basically, this is the transmitted form. This is the original revelation of the Quran to Muhammad that is passed on. That's knowledge of the law. And then there's the works. This is what the Sufis would call the way. So this is the actual practice, that the actual spiritual practices that a Sufi or a Muslim puts themselves through and actually does. So you've got law, works, and then probably the most important or one of the most typical to Sufism is the third, spiritual realization, which is the truth. So you've got this form, the form that the knowledge takes, which is, in the case of Sufism, the Quran, And then there's the inner meaning that is discerned through the experience of the practitioner and through their own practice. So this would be meditative practices, contemplation. In modern Sufi orders, for instance, you can look up the Sufi practices. They basically engage in certain types of prayer and meditation and dancing, of course. Rumi started the whirling dervish thing, so that's where whirling dervishes come from, apparently. And with the goal, so that would be like the way or the path is the actual practice, leading to the goal of spiritual realization, the realization of truth. And at that level, at the level of spiritual realization, as Rumi puts it in some of his poetry, that kind of negates the necessity now for the law and the way.
Mm-hmm.
Because once you've achieved the goal, you no longer need the path because you're already at your destination, and you no longer need the form, which is the law, because you embody the law. As Chittick puts it, the Sufi becomes the doctrine at that point. So there's no need for the doctrine because you embody the doctrine in your very being. And the way you get there is through the middle section, the works or the way. That is what would be the kind of the inner alchemy or climbing the ladder. These are two symbol systems or image or forms of imagery that the Sufis used that also show up in more like Western esotericism, like the ladder. That's in Hermeticism. That's in Gurdjieff too. The inner alchemy, of course, in Western alchemy, as well as again Gurdjieff too talks about alchemy. And but to come back to the transmission aspect, in Sufism, there is the necessity for a master to guide you through the process. So that's another tension that's also within the Gurdjieff system, because for Gurdjieff, he also says you need a teacher, you need a master. You can't climb the stairway on your own. You need someone to kind of show you the steps and act in place of the thing which is growing within you, to kind of get you past the hurdle that you wouldn't otherwise be able to pass. And so you see the same thing in Sufism, the need for a teacher or a master. But so I just wanted to highlight that kind of tension, mm-hmm. both the need for a tradition and a line of transmission, but also the kind of the openness to this kind of lack of transmission that comes in this instance of kind of just pure divine revelation. And I think that's what might be behind the idea of the prophet, a specially prepared individual. Gurdjieff might call them messengers from above that's their purpose. Their purpose is to act as that anchor, that like incarnation of truth that doesn't necessarily need a transmission because they are the source of it. And so, of course, Sufis would argue that Muhammad was the epitome, the last and greatest prophet. And other traditions will argue that they have the best prophet. And it's like, well, no, I've got the best prophet. But again, just to round that out, there are some of course, just some similar things in Paul too, about something that we haven't got into yet, like the whole idea of the fall and the interpretation of the fall is there in Sufism as well as Paul, like we discussed several weeks ago in our discussion of that. But also, I'll leave it there. We might get back to some correspondences to Paul a bit later on.
So, one of the ideas that Chittick tries to get across in his distillation of the importance of the Sufi teachings is this kind of dichotomy or tension between all of the religious ideas that would compel a person to, as I was saying a little earlier, be dogmatic about religion and to not pay attention to one's own thoughts. And what Chittick says basically is that our thoughts are the kind of medium, are the substance, are very real things that we don't give enough credence to, precisely because we're so immersed in material, superficial, ego-centered reality. So just going to read a portion here because it speaks to some of this really well. He says, Islamic forms of thinking take it for granted that God is the source of all reality. The universe and all things within it appear from God in stages, just as light appears from the sun by degrees. The spiritual world, which the Quran calls the unseen, al-ghaib, is the realm of life, awareness, and intelligence. The bodily world, which the Quran calls the visible, al-shahada, is the realm of death, unawareness, and unintelligence. The closer a creature is situated to God, the more immersed it is in the light of intelligence, consciousness, and thought. Angels and spirits who inhabit the unseen are vastly more intense in luminosity and intelligence than most inhabitants of the visible realm. Which reminds me a little bit of our afterlife show, because in that discussion, there was this idea that there are these various spheres of existence in the afterlife, where there are intelligences and beings of a wholly different physical nature that are, to varying degrees, living in environments that are more luminous than others, and more sublime and less coarse than the lower spheres, or less coarse and luminescent than our sphere. So I thought that was something that came up. In this way of looking at things, human beings who were placed on the earth to God's vicegerents, Khalifa, and I wonder if he means vice-regents, are nothing but thought. Their awareness and consciousness determine their reality. Their thoughts mold their nature and shape their destiny. The great Persian poet Rumi, a true master of the intellectual tradition, reminds us of thought's primacy in his verses. Brother, you are this very thought. The rest of you is bones and fiber. If roses are your thought, you are a rose garden. If thorns, you are fuel for the furnace. If rose water, you will be sprinkled on the neck. If urine, you will be dumped in the pit. So there's a lot of wisdom in that. You are what you think. And that the world is made up of thoughts and the unseen and the generally unknowable, precisely because we're caught up in our 3D physical existence, where we lose sight of the materiality of thought and its impact and its existence in the ether and its connection to other people. We give out thoughts all the time. Sometimes we pick up on thoughts from others without even realizing it, or sometimes realizing it. And there is an attention that seems to be an importance here of thinking about what you're thinking about, of metacognition, of knowing yourself through knowing your thoughts and of questioning your thoughts. And that's just another really pertinent part of the intellectual tradition as Chittick presents it.
Well, yeah, as I've been reading these works, I've been continuously reminded of the show that we did on Epictetus, and his number one focus was, the only thing that you can control are your thoughts. That's the realm of the gods. In your thoughts, you are closer to the gods than you're closer to anything else. And I just continued to be struck by how Ibn al-Arabi seemed to be more just a more imaginative, like an Epictetus with an extra faculty.
Yeah.
You know, he had a faculty that Epictetus, for whatever reason, for I don't know why. I mean, he was obviously a brilliant philosopher, absolutely intelligent, just heads over heels over most other men. But then, in the same regard, Ibn al-Arabi is exponentially more intelligent. But it's not because he thought of all of these different things and logically deduced that there must be all these different forms, but it's because in some way and on some level through some faculty, and he would probably say it's the imagination, the faculty of imagination, he saw these things. Mm-hmm. He saw the reality of being and the structure of being, and then he tried to describe that and put it on paper and deduce, different conclusions that you can draw from this reality that he saw. And by doing so, he was, in many ways, he was transducing a knowledge that you can't just just a normal guy go out there and if you're a naturalist and you spend all of your life studying nature, you're not going to come to this kind of a conclusion. You're not going to understand the world of being. But if you're someone like Ibn al-Arabi, and that's your job, is to understand the world of being, then you can become like a naturalist of that world. And it's obviously people will always argue that this is all just in somebody's imagination. This is all just make believe and this and that. And of course, Ibn al-Arabi was facing the same kinds of things back then. And so it's just a perennial complaint, because there will always be people who don't have that faculty. And there will always be people who can delude themselves into believing they have that faculty, or who want to delude others into believing they have that faculty, because it's it's so highly subjective. We just don't have access to these realms of information, and that's why we are, a lot of us like sheep. Yeah. We're a lot like sheep in that sense, in that we need some sort of a trustworthy, shamanic type figure that can structure and build a world. And you want them to structure a world, a religious system, a universe that is as close to reality as possible. Without that, the universe is chaos. We forget, I think, how important individuals with this kind of ability are, and how important it is to have a vocabulary of faith and to be able to understand these basic drives that we have, the basic drive to exist, and to be able to understand that in a way that it's not just, I'm just existing because of this career. I'm just existing because of this identity or that identity, or this politician, now it's that politician, or it's this. All of these things, these are just horrible substitutes for knowing your place in the cosmos. Mm-hmm. They're horrible substitutes for being able to have a vocabulary of faith that says that you're striving to be, because that's the charge that God has given all of life on this planet. Yeah. That it's a sacred command, and that we, as humans, we have a special place in this cosmos, because we share in this mind, this mind that, as you were saying, Elon, it's so easy to forget that we have this unique ability to think and to change our thoughts and to analyze our thoughts, and then to thereby change our lives. We could radically change our lives and change the lives of everyone around us if we have the right words, if we have the right motivation, if we have the right meaning, and if we have a heart.
Right names.
If we have a heart, yes, then the right names too. I mean, it's so many of us, like you said, it's a world of death and confusion, because all of these things are just muddled together. It's all kind of just a big kind of nullity, because it's not sharply defined, and the map, I guess you'd say, the map of meaning is just off. So you think that you're going to the town across the way, but your map has you going to the opposite direction, and you just keep driving and driving and driving and wondering why you never got there. Well, it's because our maps are crap. They're just shoddy, and we need one, for our time, and we're not going to get it by just going out and looking at the forests and the rain, this and that. We need spiritual awareness and spiritual guidance.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, like a new vocabulary, to be able to know where we're at and where we're going. And coming back to the idea of these traditions and how they come into the world, I think Gurdjieff provided that for like the 20th century, a new vocabulary for this truth, this kind of inner truth that pops up throughout cultures and throughout history, but that loses its applicability to certain cultures and certain peoples and certain times. And sometimes the form decays and becomes ineffectual, useless for certain peoples to actually benefit from. So it needs to be reinvigorated every once in a while. And you spoke about the faculty, the faculty that al-Arabi had in particular, and that perhaps Epictetus didn't have. And one of the things about al-Arabi is that he described basically the stations and states of the Sufi path, of the Sufi way. So these are the experiences that come. The states will be the kind of individual experiences, what can be translated as like spiritual inrushings as a result of these openings. So these are the kind of mystical experiences that can be experienced or on the way. And then there are the stations. These are the virtues that are acquired and kind of retained, as I guess you could say, as one develops their character or grows in being or just develops spiritually. And al-Arabi basically gave warnings that all divine inrushing or all inrushings aren't from the same source. He divided them into 4 different sources. The divine, so from the very top, from oneness, from the absolute level of being. Spiritual, so that would be like from the spiritual realms. But then there are also 2 other sources: the ego itself, egocentrism, and satanic. So there are these different sources of inrushings. And Chittick points out that if you look at a modern tradition like the New Age, the catch-all New Age community, there's no differentiation between the source of inrushings. It's just you have a great experience, and it's this mystical experience, and now you're what's J.P. Sears's phrase for it? Ultra spiritual, right? Because you've experienced the divine inrushing of one sort or another, but it's like you said, you're like a babe in the woods. You don't know what's going on. You don't know how to differentiate any of these things. That's, again, where the need for a master, for a sheikh in the Sufi tradition or a teacher is necessary to help you discern, because you don't know these things. You're like a beginner in mathematics. You don't know what's what. You need someone to kind of show you the ropes. Hopefully someone that knows what they're talking about, but you've got a whole bunch of charlatans and people you can't trust, and people pretending they know something, or people who think they know something and don't actually. So it is a rough place to be in. It is a perilous path, a perilous time and place to be in, where you don't have, or we collectively don't have, someone we can just implicitly trust with this kind of thing, because partially because it is such a it's so at odds with our culture today. It's not something that is taught in elementary school, for instance. It's just not part of our everyday life. On that, I want to just bring it back to a few of the ideas that come out particularly in Rumi, and this will tie back to the shows we did on Christianity, on Paul in particular. And there's this idea that we mentioned already about self-knowledge, right? And the importance of self-knowledge. That's the only knowledge that actually matters. But on the other hand, that isn't to say that all knowledge of external things or of cosmology, or not modern cosmology as in like astronomy, but the nature of reality and all that stuff. It's not to say that isn't important, because like Rumi would say, I think that that first facet of Sufism, knowledge or the law, which might include things like this, is that theory, as opposed to practice. That theory is what provides the kind of picture of where you're heading. Like you need a picture of the context in which you're acting in order to act properly. So part of self-knowledge will be to have a proper framework in which to place yourself. Where am I? How do I fit in the grand scheme of things? And what is my path through that kind of jungle? You need both. But the full realization, like the path that you are going towards, is self-knowledge. And what is self-knowledge? Well, the part of the spiritual realization is that, as Gurdjieff would say, and as Rumi says too, is of a realization of one's own non-entity, that you are really nothing, that there is nothing special about you. You are the most insignificant speck. But on the other hand, from another perspective, you are all important, because the true self, what you are actually trying to discover, or in the process of coming to know, you find that the truth behind the true self is actually God. So by acquiring self-knowledge, you are actually acquiring knowledge of God, because you are like this fractal, like holographic representation of God, that you as the microcosm encompass all of that. So with the secrets within or the treasure within is illimitable. It's unlimited because it is everything, because on the ultimate level, through that connection of your own like spark of divinity, you actually are God. And that's the kind of the controversial aspect of mysticism in general, because, well, I'll read a quote from Rumi. First Chittick kind of introducing it. First there's a quote from the Quran, or it might be a hadith. Let me find it. It's on page 31. So this will give the context for what I'll read next. So this is God speaking. I was a hidden treasure, and I wanted to be known, so I created the world. So now, Chittick writes, through the spiritual path, man awakens from his slumber, and finds that he is not what he had thought himself to be. He is not that particular mode of consciousness with which he had identified himself. And man does not achieve anything by realizing union with God. Rather, he becomes what he had always been in his inmost nature. God is the real, and nothing can be outside his reality. So now he quotes Rumi. Take the famous utterance, I am God. Some men reckon it a great pretension, but I am God is in fact a great humility. The man who says, I am the servant of God, asserts that two exist, one himself and the other God. But he who says, I am God, has knotted himself, made himself nothing, and cast himself to the winds. He says, I am God. That is, I am not. He is all. Nothing has existence but God. I am pure non-entity. I am nothing. In this, the humility is greater. So this comes back to Tawheed, there is no God but God, or I guess that's one way of phrasing it. Is that the right way? Is it?
It's one of the
yeah. So the unity of everything is God. And in that, if we tie this back to some of our first shows that we did, where we talked about Whitehead and the different kind of theologies and ways of looking at the nature of God, in most Western religions, God is a transcendent being, totally other. And for Sufis, that would be what they call shirk, or associating with other gods. Basically saying that there is something that exists separate from God. Because if you have a transcendent God who is over and above creation, now you have God separated from his creation. And that is, in essence, to set up separate God, a separate or a separate kind of absolute, whereas there is only one God. There is only one. So the idea of this transcendent God removed from reality, removed from creation, is actually a form of idolatry, according to the Sufis. And it's not that God is purely immanent in creation, because that is to identify the absolute or God with every individual part of creation. That's to set up an infinite number of gods at odds with each other, totally separate, having totally separate sources of power. So the Sufi tradition is actually in line with Whitehead's conception of God and Hartshorne, Whitehead's students, which is, in the philosophical tradition called panentheism, that God is both transcendent and immanent, that God is within every part of creation and also transcendent above it. And there's a point where Chittick talks about this in relation to either Arabi or Rumi. I can't remember which, but he basically says, well, there's a section, if you want to get the book, just get the book and read it. It's the section on, maybe I'll read a bit. So this is on the chapter on God and the world. So he's talking about the transcendence or incomparability of God, that's the tanzi, and the immanence or resemblance, tasbih. So Chittick writes, as Ibn Arabi often points out in his Fusus al-Hikam, the Quran summarizes these 2 points of view in the verse, nothing is like him, and he is the hearing, the seeing. Chittick, there is nothing like God, so he is absolutely transcendent. But inasmuch as a being hears or sees, it is from God that these attributes have come. Or to be more exact, it is God who in reality is seeing and hearing. This gets back to what I said about the spiritual realization being that the self, the true nature of the self, behind the false self that is kind of destroyed and dies in this spiritual death and rebirth, the true self is actually God himself, God itself. So, and that previous quote from Rumi about I am God, that just reminded me of, well, there are a couple of things in there that remind me of the conversation we had with Joseph Azizi in his book, where he talks about, first of all, the importance of the phrase I am in Gurdjieff, and especially his exercises. That was one of Gurdjieff's central ideas, I am. And that not only was that kind of almost a mantra for certain spiritual exercises, but there's so much contained in that statement. And I think, like Azizi said in the show, he quoted a recollection of Maurice Nicoll that Gurdjieff had told him that behind real I, which is kind of the goal of the Gurdjieff system, behind real I lies God. So it's the same concepts in Sufism. The discovery of the real I, to be able to really say I am, I exist, I am existing, is to say, well, the heretical statement I am God, but like Rumi says, there is a supreme humility about that statement by saying, because what that really means is my individual self, am nothing. I'm a non-entity. The only thing that exists that has any real meaning is the totality, is the source from which I come, and from which all my faculties come. So for the Sufis, when the real I sees or hears, it is actually God seeing or hearing. And this is the thing, the big thing that ties back to the Apostle Paul, where Paul is talking about the faith of Christ and God's faith and God's dominion and all of these properties of God. And like we discussed on the shows on that, when the way in which those things manifest is through humanity, is through us. So the kingdom of God is not some kingdom external to us that God's going to send this earthly representative and he's going to rule over us like a medieval king or something like that. No, it's God's dominion, the idea of how of just the action of God, the work of God is manifested through us, through people, through individuals. But in order for that to happen, there has to be this kind of destruction of the old self, of the like the fallen self, the Adamic self. Mm-hmm. And we don't have time to get into it today, but there are all kinds of passages in this book in particular on the Sufi kind of interpretation of the fall, of Adam's fall, and how that relates to kind of the cosmos in general, and why there exists this separation between God. Why is there a multiplicity? If God is one, why are there many things? Well, part of the answer is the quote that I said that, I was a treasure hidden, and I created the world in order to discover it, in order to essentially know myself. And the idea of the fall of Adam and what that entailed, that was the identification with this separate self and the loss of the ability to see the true nature, that it was an identification with the separateness, and a closing off of that vision of reality. And so the path forward, the path upward, is to regain that vision and enriched through the experience of climbing that path, to then reintegrate with that with the true self, with the real self, what you always in fact were, but had lost connection to and forgotten, in order basically to remember yourself, gain a true I, and be able to say, I am God. Maybe not. But we've been going for an hour, so I think we will stop there. Any final words, guys? Any last words? No? Okay.
I am God seems to be a good place to end it.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'll just say I'm not saying that.
A direct quote.
So, thanks for tuning in, everyone. We'll be returning probably to some Sufi stuff later on. So everyone take care, and read some books.